The Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously said that change is the only constant. He also compared the flow of existence to the ever-changing nature of a river, observing that you never step in the same river twice. But not all change is created equal. Some change comes in like a gentle rain, caressing the fertile fields, bringing growth and new life. And change like that is something to be welcomed, celebrated. One of those kinds of changes is something we have been talking about a lot in our church lately, and that is calling a new pastor to be the settled pastor of this congregation. You have been preparing for this change for 2 years now. Isn't it hard to believe that it's already been 2 years? And last week, this congregation had 2 days to meet and talk with and get to know the candidate brought forward by the search committee for that new settled pastor position. And at the end of that time, you voted to call your new pastor to serve this church and to usher this church into its future, a future that God has been preparing for you. This kind of change that you've been working for, preparing for, that God is nurturing you towards and helping you welcome, it's good change. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a little stressful. All change can be stressful, and there will be some goodbyes as well as some long-awaited and eager hellos in store in the next couple of months. But I am confident that you are prepared to navigate this change, and that the work we have been doing together is sufficient unto the task that lies ahead of you and ahead of us as we manage this kind of change together. Other changes are not so gentle and not so well prepared for. Other changes rush in like a flood, sweeping away everything in its path. And then there is even a different kind of change yet, one that burns. And whether that fire reduces everything to ash or releases the phoenix to new life may depend on where you sit in relation to that change. Well, I want to acknowledge that among those of us here in worship this morning, some of us may be getting just a little tired of change. We have been going through a lot of change in the last months. We've had months of a global pandemic turning our lives upside down with no end in sight. We've had 93 days of protests in Portland following the horrific murder of George Floyd. And after shootings this past week that left Jacob Blake paralyzed, and tragically three protesters killed, including one shot just last night in Portland. Perhaps you have already seen this tragic news. We may be getting a little weary of turmoil and turbulent change. We're suffering from an historic economic recession, and we are facing deep uncertainty about where we're headed as a nation as we careen towards an election season like probably none of us have experienced in our lifetimes. Some of us may simply be exhausted from all this change. Yet even in the midst of such turbulence, others among us are hungry. We are actually ready for more change, and we want better change. As Sam Cooke sang during the height of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, "Oh, when I go to my brother, I'd say, 'Brother, help me, please.' But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. There have been times that I thought I wouldn't last for long. Now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will." As I gathered with nearly hundreds, maybe nearly 1,000 Black Lives Matter activists at the NAACP's March on Portland on Friday, I listened to the Reverend E.D. Mondonay lament the fact that on this anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington, too little has changed. He talked about the fact that the promissory notes of our country are still coming back, marked insufficient funds for Black, brown, and indigenous people of color and low-income Americans. Black Americans are still being hunted down in our streets by police and vigilantes, and people of color are dying at a greatly disproportionate rate from COVID-19 and other diseases. For those who know that justice delayed is justice denied, change is long overdue. And I know that others among us are hungry for the change that we hope the election might bring, even if it is simply a change that restores what we see as long-standing norms of democracy, decency, rule of law, and fairness. Some among us are so hungry for change, they may be ready to burn the house down to get it. Others are so fearful of change that they are arming themselves with flags and guns to protect the house that white privilege built. Well, whether we are afraid of change, tired of change, or desperate for change, we all are facing the same reality. Whether we welcome it or not, a change is gonna come. And unfortunately, change is rarely smooth and often messy. Fortunately, we have resources in our faith tradition that we can draw on to help us navigate change, to cope with change. Resources teaching people about change and enacting the change that Jesus is bringing into the world. And we also have an opportunity, a window into how some of the folks were responding to all this change. And we see that some in Jesus's community embraced the changes Jesus was bringing about as he strove to reform the tradition that he had inherited. And we see that others were deeply unsettled by the changes he was ushering in. So I wonder what clues we might find in our text from Matthew today that might help us think about how to respond to change positively rather than defensively. When you hear the story of Jesus inviting that tax collector, Levi, to follow him, and then joining him in his home to eat with him, I wonder if you hear what I hear in this story, which is a warning not to get too attached to our labels for people. In this story, Jesus models what true welcome and authentic inclusivity really looks like. Now, you probably have heard that tax collectors in Roman-occupied Palestine were deeply distrusted, even despised. But have you ever wondered what the equivalent of a tax collector would be in today's divided society? Now, for some folks, it might still be a tax collector. Let's face it, not all are big fans of the IRS. But I wonder what other kind of people might be in the tax collector's shoes today. Maybe it's the young anarchist who set last night or the night before's dumpster fire. Or maybe it's the Proud Boy or the gun-toting patriot prayer guy swaggering into the streets of downtown Portland looking for a fight. And maybe how we determine which one is the tax collector depends on which one is harder for us to see as a child of God. After all, Jesus said that he came not to call righteous people, but sinners to change their hearts and their lives. And before we're too quick to label either the anarchist or the Proud Boy as the sinner, let's remember Pastor Heath's warning that Jesus has changed everyone's understanding of what it means to worship God. So who is Jesus challenging to welcome to our table today? And here is maybe an even tougher question. Where today do we see the crucified Christ? Is it only in the people whose cause we believe in? If it were, I doubt that what Pastor Heath said would be true about Jesus making our lives feel less safe and less comfortable. In fact, I suspect that the crucified Christ is seen for us most clearly in the person whom we have the hardest time loving and seeing as God's child. So, could the crucified Christ be bleeding and dying in the faces of those we perceive even to be our enemies? What difference would it make, I wonder, if Christians on both sides of the political spectrum today could see Jesus bleeding and dying in the people that they have the most difficult time relating to? What if folks on the right could see Jesus bleeding and dying in George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and in Anthony Huber and Joseph Rosenbaum, the protesters killed in cold blood by Kyle Rittenhouse, rather than defending Kyle Rittenhouse, as some of these Christians are doing? What if folks on the left could see Christ crucified in the unidentified patriot prayer man who was shot last night in our own streets? How many more deaths will it take until we wake up and see the truly radical nature of Jesus's message that no one is outside the circle of God's grace, that no one is beyond the possibility of forgiveness and transformation, and that hate is never justified, even hate in our hearts, even when it is in service of our own conception of justice? For over 400 years, a toxic brew has been bubbling in our land. It began when Europeans set foot on this continent and made the fateful choice to conquer rather than co-inhabit it with the original peoples of this land, and to enrich themselves through the enslavement of African people. I have begun recently to wrestle with my own family's blood-stained legacy as I have been piecing together my family tree and doing some DNA studies. And I have been finding hidden in plain sight the slaveholders and settlers in my own past. The wine of American-style racism is well-aged. The wineskins that have been crafted to hold and protect the white privilege of those of us with light skin have done their job well. Our financial and legal and law enforcement mechanisms have operated just as intended to protect white property and white lives. And there are still so many among us who love the taste of this well-aged American wine. It goes down so smooth. But now a new wine is fermenting that's gonna burst those old wineskins. And Jesus is warning us, you've gotta find some new wineskins for that fresh wine, because a change is gonna come. And whether it comes in as rain that refreshes or a flood that washes away everything in its path will depend a lot on how we receive it. Will those of us who love that well-aged wine be as impervious as concrete, rigid in our rejection of the calls to dismantle and defund a rigged system? Or will we soften into a welcoming receptiveness to the changes that are coming? Will we prepare the new wineskins we need as a society to hold a new and ultimately better homegrown American vintage? The vintage of true justice and the wine of liberty and justice for all, not just for some. And as we struggle to find our footing as the ground shifts beneath our feet, can we remember, no matter what side of the spectrum we're on, to spare some compassion for those who resist the needed change because they sense intuitively that there will be some cost to them and those they hold dear? Can we seek ways to bring one another across all our divides into the new world emerging in our midst, rather than consigning those we disagree with to the outer darkness? And if we cannot, what hope is there for this blood-stained land? The reality is, we have not become enemies of one another overnight. We have been structured into enemy case for over 400 years. This structure will not be dismantled easily. It will be messy. What can people of faith do? What can the inheritors of the Spirit and light and resurrected life of the living Christ do to create those new wineskins that we need to house that new wine that is brewing in our midst today? And how do we move ahead in the weeks and months that are coming? I have just a few suggestions. First of all, we have to pray like we have never prayed before. I know that many among you truly believe in the power of prayer. May I ask that you would mentor those of us that struggle with prayer. We need those of you who are true prayer warriors, who know how to pray, who know how to root yourself in that intercessory relationship with God, to hold up to God the struggles and the sufferings of the people and of our country and our world into the light of God. We need you to mentor us in prayer. And for those of us who are unused to the discipline of prayer, can we find ways to tap into that channel of communion with the divine love and the divine energy and the divine spirit, which courses through all that is, so that we may partner with the forces of life and light, with the life of God, to bring about change as peacefully and non-violently as possible. So we can pray. We can also prepare. We can prepare ourselves and our community for the upcoming election, which I know many of us are fearful of. Regardless of the outcome, we fear what will happen as a result of this election. There are some ways that faith communities are organizing right now in the United Church of Christ and in our broader ecumenical community to participate in constructive ways in our democratic project, this fragile and precious project of the nonviolent and peaceful transfer of power that we hold so dear. We have the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign through the United Church of Christ that is inspiring us and suggesting ways that we can get involved in helping build a free and fair election and get people registered to vote and help people have access to voting. We have another campaign sponsored by my spouse Robin's organization, Eco Faith Recovery, called the Just Vote campaign, that wants to help us learn how to initiate conversations and tell stories about our own values around justice and why we vote and why we vote the way we do, that can help us learn how to tell our story about how our faith influences the change that we want to see in the world. And we can organize a team right here in our local church to work constructively towards peaceful, free, fair, and fully accessible elections. And we're going to talk about that in the coffee hour, so I invite you to stay and join in that discussion. Finally, I remind us all, and I remind myself, that in the midst of sometimes bone-rattling change that is as scary as it can be exhilarating, God is with us. It's amazing when you look back at the testimony of people of faith throughout the ages and you see how they have maintained a spirit of joy and a spirit of gratitude, even in the hardest times. We are going to sing a song of thanksgiving at the end of the service today. Now thank we all our God. And when I originally put this song at the end of the service, I was thinking of celebrating the call to the new settled pastor for this congregation, celebrating the blessings that this congregation is receiving. And yet now, as we head into the end of this service and we sing this song together, I'm also mindful that people of faith need to sing songs of gratitude even in the midst of acts of violence like that which our city was shaken by last night. We have to sing a thankful song no matter what is happening in our midst, because God is with us. And so as we go forth into the future that lies in store for us, as we steel ourselves for the change that is coming, let us remember those ringing words of Isaiah. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I, your God, am with you. Thanks be to God, that God is always with us, and then that light of God in our hearts truly can never be extinguished. Amen.